In 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down a ruling meant to punish John D. Rockefeller. The court ordered his company, Standard Oil, the largest, most dominant business in the country, to be broken apart into more than 30 separate companies. It was intended as a defeat. It was meant to end his empire. In the years that followed, Rockefeller became richer than he had ever been before. How is that possible? How does breaking up a man's monopoly make him wealthier than the monopoly did? To answer that, we have to understand two things. First, how Rockefeller built a company that controlled roughly 90% of an entire industry. And second, why the pieces of that company, set free, turned out to be worth far more than the whole. This is Market Cap Stories. Today, how Rockefeller won by losing Standard Oil. To understand what Rockefeller did, you first have to understand the industry he stepped into, because it was, in a word, chaos. In the 1860s, crude oil had only recently become a valuable commodity, mainly because it could be refined into kerosene, which gave people cheap, bright light in their homes, replacing more expensive fuels. Demand was exploding, and so thousands of people rushed into the business. Anyone who could drill a well drilled one. Anyone who could build a small refinery built one. The result was a textbook case of an industry with no discipline. There were far too many producers and far too many refiners, all competing against each other when too many sellers chase the same market. Basic economics takes over. Prices crash, profits vanish. The oil business of that era swung wildly. Booms followed by busts, fortunes made and then wiped out, refineries opening and going bankrupt within a year. Now, here is the key strategic observation, and Rockefeller saw with unusual clarity. In a chaotic, overcrowded industry, the chaos itself is the opportunity. An industry in disorder is an industry waiting to be organized. If one company could impose order, could control the chaos, reduce the wild competition, and bring stability to prices, that company would capture enormous, reliable profit. Rockefeller did not see a messy industry. He saw an industry that was begging to be consolidated, and he intended to be the one who did it. Rockefeller entered the oil business on the refining side, turning crude oil into kerosene. And his first great weapon was not secret or clever. It was discipline. It was an almost fanatical obsession with cost. Rockefeller understood something that many of his competitors did not. In a commodity business, and refined kerosene was a commodity, roughly the same. Whoever made it, the producer with the lowest cost, wins. If your cost to refine a barrel is lower than your rivals, then at any given selling price, you earn more profit than they do. And if prices fall, you can survive at a price that bankrupts them. Low cost is not just more profit. Low cost is staying power. So Rockefeller drove cost out of his refineries with relentless attention. He examined every step of the process. A famous example, he noticed that the metal containers for kerosene were sealed with drops of solder, and he asked whether the number of drops could be reduced. The answer, after testing, was yes, a tiny saving on a single container, but multiplied across millions of containers. That tiny saving became real money. Rockefeller also pushed toward scale and integration. He built his refineries large because larger refineries had lower cost per barrel. He began to control the things around the refining itself. He made his own barrels. He bought his own timber to make them. He acquired his own warehouses, his own transport. Each step reduced his dependence on outside suppliers who might charge him a premium, and reduced his cost a little further. So before we reach anything controversial, it is important to be fair. A significant part of Rockefeller's early advantage was genuine, legitimate excellence. He ran better, cheaper, more efficient refineries than most of his rivals. That part of the story is simply good management. But Rockefeller did not stop at being the best refiner. He wanted to control the entire industry, and for that, cost discipline alone was not enough. This brings us to the most powerful and most controversial weapon in Rockefeller's rise. It involved the railroads in that era. Oil moved by rail. Crude oil came to the refineries by train, and refined kerosene went out to the markets by train. Transport was a major cost, and the railroads who charged for it were themselves in fierce competition with one another, desperate for reliable, high-volume freight. Rockefeller used that situation with great skill because his refining operation was large and growing. He could promise a railroad something very valuable, a huge, steady volume of shipping, and in exchange for that promise, he negotiated a rebate. Here is what a rebate meant: the railroad would publish an official shipping rate. Other shippers paid that rate, but Rockefeller secretly would pay the railroad the full rate, and then the railroad would quietly pay a portion of it back to him. Sit with what this accomplished. Rockefeller's real, true cost of shipping oil was now lower, often substantially lower, than the cost paid by every competing refiner, and his competitors often did not even know the rebate was secret. A rival refiner might be paying the published rate, believing it was the same rate everyone paid, while Rockefeller was effectively paying far less. That rival would find his profits mysteriously thinner, his position mysteriously weaker, without fully understanding why. Rockefeller later pushed this even further. At one stage, he negotiated arrangements in which the railroads would pay him a rebate not only on his own shipments, but also a payment on the shipments of his competitors. Read that again. For a period, under certain schemes, every barrel a rival shipped could generate a payment that flowed to Rockefeller. His competitors were, without consenting to it, helping to fund the very company that was trying to destroy them. With these advantages in place: lower refining cost, lower transport cost, Rockefeller began the work of consolidation. He set out to absorb the refining industry itself. His method had a recognizable pattern. Rockefeller would approach a competing refiner, and he would make an offer to buy them out. The offer was often genuinely reasonable. Sometimes Rockefeller would offer a fair price or shares in his own company, which were becoming valuable to a rival who could see the situation clearly. Selling to Rockefeller was not obviously a bad deal, but underneath the reasonable offer was a hard reality. The rival knew or came to understand that Rockefeller had lower costs, secret rebates, and growing power over the railroads. The rival knew that if they refused to sell, they would face a competitor who could undercut their prices indefinitely and outlast them in any price war. So the choice Rockefeller effectively presented was this: sell to me now at a fair price and walk away with something, or refuse and be ground down by competition. You cannot win until you have nothing. This pattern worked with remarkable speed in a famous concentrated burst in the early 1870s, sometimes called the Cleveland Conquest. Rockefeller acquired the great majority of the competing refineries in Cleveland, then a center of American refining. In a matter of weeks, he then repeated the approach in other cities. Within a few years, Standard Oil controlled an overwhelming share, eventually something like 90% of all oil refining in the United States. And once Standard Oil controlled refining, its power reached backward and forward through the whole industry. With 90% of refining capacity, Standard Oil was the only real buyer of crude oil at scale, which gave it enormous power over the price it paid to the people who drilled, and it was the dominant seller of kerosene, which gave it great power over the price paid by everyone who bought light for their home. Standard Oil sat in the middle of the entire industry, and the industry flowed through it. As Standard Oil grew, Rockefeller faced a genuine organizational problem, and the solution he and his lawyers devised was so significant that it gave a new word to the language of business. The problem was this: Standard Oil now owned or controlled companies in many different states, but the laws of that era made it legally awkward for a company chartered in one state to simply own companies in many other states. Rockefeller needed a way to control a sprawling collection of businesses across the country as if they were one, unified in strategy, pricing, and management. The solution was the trust. In a trust arrangement, the shareholders of all the many separate Standard Oil companies handed their shares over to a single central group of trustees. Those trustees then held and controlled all of it, every company, all together, and ran them as one coordinated enterprise. In exchange, the former shareholders received trust certificates which entitled them to their share of the combined profits. Through this structure, a small central group led by Rockefeller gained unified control over a business empire that legally spanned the whole nation. This is where the word trust entered business language in its modern sense. When people later spoke of the trusts or passed antitrust laws, the word traced directly back to this kind of structure. The Standard Oil Trust was, for its time, a genuine organizational innovation. It allowed a scale and coordination of business that had rarely if ever, been achieved before. But that same structure was also exactly what alarmed the public and eventually the government. It concentrated enormous economic power in very few hands. By the late 19th century, Standard Oil had become a target of public anger, of journalism, and finally of the law. Several forces converged. Investigative journalists of the era, most famously a writer named Ida Tarbell, who had a personal family connection to the oil industry. Standard Oil had absorbed, published detailed, damaging accounts of how the company had actually risen, the secret rebates, the pressure on competitors, the methods of consolidation. These were laid out for the public to read. Standard Oil became, in the public mind, the very symbol of monopoly power and its abuses. Meanwhile, the United States had passed a major antitrust law, legislation designed to combat exactly the kind of monopolistic combination that Standard Oil represented. The government brought a case against the company. It worked its way up through the courts, and in 1911 it reached the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled against Standard Oil. It found that the company was an unlawful monopoly that had unreasonably restrained trade, and its remedy was dramatic. The court ordered that the Standard Oil Trust be dissolved, broken apart into more than 30 separate independent companies. Each piece would become its own corporation with its own management, competing, at least in principle, against the others. On its face, this was a historic defeat, the destruction of the greatest industrial empire of its age, and yet the financial outcome for Rockefeller himself was the opposite of what the punishment intended. Here is the mechanism, and it is a genuine, satisfying piece of financial logic. When the trust was broken up, the shares of the new separate companies were distributed to the shareholders of the old trust, and John D. Rockefeller was by far the largest shareholder in the Standard Oil Trust. So after the breakup, Rockefeller did not own one monopoly. He owned a very large stake in every single one of the more than 30 successor companies. He held a piece of all of them. Now, here is why that turned out to be so valuable. As separate, independent companies, the pieces could be valued individually by the stock market. Each one had its own shares, which traded on their own, and the stock market, looking at these pieces, saw something attractive. Each successor company was still a strong, well-run business in a fast-growing industry, and critically, the timing was extraordinary. The breakup happened in 1911, and in the years that followed, demand for oil did something historic. The automobile was beginning its rise. Gasoline, once a relatively minor product of refining, was becoming one of the most important commodities in the world. The oil industry was entering one of the great growth periods in economic history. So the successor companies, now independently traded, rose in value strongly, and together the combined market value of all the pieces within a few years climbed well above the value the single trust had ever had, and Rockefeller owned a large share of every piece. His personal fortune rose to its all-time peak after the breakup, not before it. So, What is the durable lesson? Here, the part worth carrying into the next case. There are, in fact, two lessons here, and they sit in tension, which is what makes them worth holding together. The first lesson is about how monopolies are actually built. Standard Oil's dominance was not only a story of being the best, though Rockefeller genuinely was an excellent operator. It was also a story of structural advantage, the secret rebates, the leverage over transport, the pressure that made competitors sell. When you see a company with overwhelming market share, the useful question is always how much of this is excellence and how much is a structural advantage that rivals simply cannot match. The second lesson is the one in the breakup itself, and it is about value. Sometimes a large combined enterprise is worth less than the sum of its parts. A sprawling whole can be hard for the market to value, can carry weaker pieces alongside strong ones, can hide the true worth of its best businesses, break it into clear, separately traded pieces, and the market can price each one on its own merits. What looked like destruction, the shattering of the trust, was, in financial terms, something closer to unlocking. The pieces set free could finally be valued for what they truly were. Two transferable lessons, one for any dominant company. Ask how much is excellence and how much is unmatched structural advantage. 2. Sometimes the parts separately valued are worth more than the whole. The court that broke up Standard Oil believed it was ending something. In a sense, it ended the trust as a single unlawful structure, but it also, without intending to, performed a kind of financial surgery that revealed how much value had been folded up inside in a market full of companies judged by their size. The story of Standard Oil is a reminder that bigger is not always worth more, and that the way a business is structured can hide or reveal what it is genuinely worth. If this is the kind of strategic anatomy you find useful, subscribe to Market Cap Stories. We will see you in the next case. Yes, in closing, no cadence promise.